The shot echoed through the canyon like thunder, sending a flock of startled ravens into the crimson-streaked sky as Garrett Aldridge spurred his stallion forward, dust billowing behind them. The stagecoach ahead had veered dangerously off the trail, one wheel spinning uselessly in the air as it teetered on the edge of disaster. He'd seen the bandits fleeing moments earlier, their saddlebags no doubt heavy with the Wells Fargo strongbox they'd been after. But Garrett wasn't concerned with them or the money, not when lives hung in the balance. "Hold on," he shouted, though he knew his voice couldn't reach the passengers trapped inside the overturned coach. His heart hammered against his ribs as he drew closer, the splintered wood and terrified horses painting a grim picture against the backdrop of the New Mexico Territory's unforgiving landscape. It was the spring of 1873, and Garrett had been tracking a herd of wild mustangs through Apache Pass when the distant crack of gunfire had pulled him from his task. At 32, he'd seen his share of robberies and accidents in these lawless parts, but something about this one sent a chill down his spine. Dismounting with practiced ease, he secured his horse to a nearby mesquite and approached the wreckage cautiously. The driver was slumped over, a dark stain spreading across his shirt beyond help now. Garrett removed his hat in a brief moment of respect before turning his attention to the coach itself. "Anyone alive in there?" he called, pulling at the door that now faced skyward. It gave way with a groan of protest. Muffled cries answered him, women's voices. Peering into the shadowy interior, he could make out three figures, an elderly man who lay motionless and two women huddled together, their fine traveling clothes now torn and bloodied. "Help us, please," the younger woman pleaded, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "My sister can't feel her legs." Garrett reached down, offering his hand. "I'm getting you both out. What's your name, Miss?" "Ruby Davis," she replied, taking his outstretched hand. "And this is my sister, Rosalind." As he pulled Ruby from the wreckage, he noted her remarkable composure. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins, framing a face smudged with dirt but unmarked by injury. She immediately turned back to the coach. "Rosie needs help. She's hurt badly." Garrett peered back into the damaged carriage. The older sister lay awkwardly against what had been the ceiling, now the floor of the coach. Her golden hair was matted with blood from a gash on her forehead, but it was the unnatural angle of her lower body that concerned him most. "Madam, I'm going to lift you out," he said gently. "This might hurt." Rosalind's eyes fluttered open, revealing a startling shade of blue. I can't feel anything below my waist," she whispered, panic edging into her voice. "Am I going to die?" Garrett carefully maneuvered himself into the coach and slid his arms beneath her. "Not on my watch," he assured her, lifting her as gently as possible. Her body felt light but broken in his arms, like a bird with damaged wings. As he emerged from the wreckage with Rosalind cradled against his chest, he saw Ruby watching them with tears streaming down her face. "You'll walk again, I swear it," he told Rosalind firmly, meeting her fearful gaze with determination. The words left his mouth before he could consider their weight, but once spoken, he felt their truth settle in his bones. It was a vow he would not break. "The nearest town is Silver Creek, about 5 miles east," he said to Ruby as he laid Rosalind carefully on a blanket spread beneath a cottonwood tree. "Your sister needs a doctor, and quick." Ruby knelt beside Rosalind, stroking her hair. "We were heading there anyway. Our uncle owns the Silver Spur Ranch outside town." Garrett nodded as he examined Rosalind's injuries more thoroughly. The head wound was superficial, but her back, that was another matter. He'd seen injuries like this before during the war, and the outcomes were rarely good. "I need to stabilize her before we move her," he explained, retrieving his canteen and some strips of cloth from his saddlebags. As he cleaned the blood from Rosalind's face, her eyes remained fixed on his, a mix of fear and something else, a fierce will to live that stirred something deep within him. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the wind that whispered through the canyon. "Garrett Aldridge, madam." "Thank you for finding us, Mr. Aldridge," he nodded, focusing on binding her wounds, just doing what any man would. No, Ruby interjected, watching him work. Most men would have gone after the bandits for the reward. You chose us instead. Garrett didn't respond immediately. She wasn't wrong. In these parts, human life often held less value than gold or glory, but he'd seen enough death in his time, dealt enough of it during the war to know the worth of a life saved. We need to fashion a stretcher, he finally said. I can't put her on a horse, and my wagon's back at my cabin. Ruby stood, brushing dust from her skirts with determined hands. I'll help, just tell me what to do. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the canyon floor, Garrett and Ruby worked together to create a makeshift stretcher using branches and Garrett's coat. Throughout their labor, he found himself impressed by Ruby's practical nature and quick thinking. She'd torn strips from her petticoat without hesitation when more bandages were needed, and had managed to calm the remaining stagecoach horse enough to harness it to their improvised transport. You handle yourself well in a crisis, Miss Davis, he remarked as they secured Rosalind to the stretcher. Ruby gave him a tired smile. Our father believed women should be self-sufficient. He taught us to shoot, ride, and think for ourselves, much to our mother's dismay. Smart man, Garrett commented, checking the bindings once more. He was, she agreed, a shadow crossing her face. He died last winter. That's why we're coming to live with our uncle. There's nothing left for us in Boston now. Garrett nodded, understanding loss all too well. I'm sorry to hear that. As they prepared to depart, Garrett recovered the traveler's luggage from the wrecked coach and secured it to his horse. The elderly passenger, they discovered, was a banker named Harold Jenkins, killed instantly when the coach overturned. They covered his body as best they could, planning to send someone back for him once they reached town. The journey to Silver Creek was slow and arduous. Garrett led the horse pulling the stretcher, constantly checking on Rosalind, while Ruby walked alongside her sister, offering words of comfort and sips of water. Night had fallen by the time the lights of the small mining town came into view, the stars overhead a brilliant canopy that seemed to mock their earthly struggles. Almost there, Garrett assured the sisters, noting how Rosalind's face had grown increasingly pale. She hadn't complained once during the journey, though he knew she must be in considerable pain. Her courage impressed him almost as much as her beauty, which persisted despite her current state. Silver Creek was a typical frontier town, one main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a handful of saloons, a general store, a small church, and, thankfully, a doctor's office. A few curious onlookers emerged as they made their way down the dusty street, the sight of an injured woman on a makeshift stretcher enough to draw attention, even in a town accustomed to tragedy. Garrett stopped outside the doctor's residence, a modest clapboard house with a shingle announcing Dr. Thomas Wilson, physician and surgeon. He banged on the door with an urgency that brought the doctor, a middle-aged man with spectacles and rumpled clothes, rushing to answer. What's happened here? Dr. Wilson asked, taking in the scene with professional detachment. Stagecoach robbery, Garrett explained briefly. Miss Davis has a spinal injury, can't feel her legs. The doctor's expression grew grave, but he nodded. Bring her inside. With Ruby's help, they carried Rosalind into the doctor's examination room, transferring her carefully onto the table. Doctor. Wilson immediately set to work, cutting away her clothing to reveal the extent of her injuries while Ruby held her sister's hand. I'll need to examine her thoroughly, the doctor said. Perhaps you could wait outside, Mr. Aldridge. Garrett Aldridge? He hesitated, reluctant to leave. I'll find the sheriff, let him know about the robbery and poor Jenkins back at the pass. Ruby looked up at him, her dark eyes filled with gratitude. Will you come back? I don't know anyone in town yet, and our uncle doesn't know we've arrived. Something in her expression made it impossible for Garrett to refuse. Of course, I'll send word to your uncle as well. The sheriff's office was just down the street, a small building with cells in the back and a desk at the front where Sheriff Frank Morgan sat cleaning his pistol. The older man looked up as Garrett entered, recognition dawning on his weathered face. Aldridge, didn't expect to see you in town. They knew each other slightly. Garrett occasionally brought pelts to trade in Silver Creek, and Morgan had once helped him track a mountain lion that had been preying on his livestock. Garrett quickly explained the situation, watching as the sheriff's expression hardened at the mention of bandits. "Sounds like the Reeves gang," Morgan said, holstering his now clean weapon. "They've been hitting coaches along that route for months. How many did you see?" "3, maybe 4. Didn't get a good look, was more concerned with the passengers." Morgan nodded, standing. "I'll send a couple of men out at first light to recover Jenkins' body and see if they left any tracks we can follow. Where can I find you if I need more details?" "I'll be at the doctor's," Garrett replied. "Those women need help." After leaving the sheriff's office, Garrett made his way to the Silver Spur Ranch, which lay about a mile outside of town. It was one of the larger spreads in the territory, run by Edmund Davis, a former cavalry officer turned rancher who'd settled in the area a decade earlier. Garrett had crossed paths with him a few times at cattle auctions, but didn't know him well. The ranch house was still lit when he arrived, and his knock brought a ranch hand to the door who fetched Davis when Garrett explained the purpose of his late visit. Edmund Davis was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a salt and pepper beard and the rigid posture of his military past. His face paled as Garrett recounted the events of the day. "Ruby and Rosalind, my God, I wasn't expecting them until next week." He immediately called for his horse to be saddled. "How bad is Rosalind's injury?" "Bad enough," Garrett answered honestly, "but Dr. Wilson is looking after her now." Davis nodded grimly. "I owe you a debt for saving my nieces, Aldridge, one I won't forget." Garrett shook his head. "No debt, just did what needed doing." By the time they returned to town, it was nearly midnight. They found Ruby sitting outside the doctor's office, her face drawn with exhaustion and worry. She rose quickly when she saw her uncle, falling into his embrace with a sob of relief. "Uncle Edmund," she murmured against his chest. "I'm here now, Ruby," he assured her before holding her at arm's length to examine her face. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head. "Just scratches, but Rosie." Her voice broke. Dr. Wilson emerged from the examination room, wiping his hands on a towel. His expression was guarded as he addressed them. "Miss Davis has suffered a severe compression of the spine," he explained. "There's significant swelling which is causing the paralysis. Whether it's temporary or permanent, I can't say for certain yet." Ruby's hand flew to her mouth and Edmund's jaw tightened. Garrett found himself clenching his fists at his sides. "She needs complete rest," the doctor continued. "No movement for at least 2 weeks. After that, we'll know more." "Can she be moved to the ranch?" Edmund asked, "Doctor." Wilson hesitated. "Not immediately. I'd prefer she stay here for a few days under my observation. Then, if there's no deterioration, she can be transported carefully to your home." Edmund nodded, placing a supportive arm around Ruby's shoulders. "We'll make arrangements." "Ruby, you'll stay at the hotel tonight. You need rest too." "I want to see Rosie first," she insisted. As Ruby went to her sister's side, Garrett found himself lingering, unable to leave without knowing Rosalind would be all right for the night. He'd made her a promise, a rash one perhaps, but one he intended to keep. Edmund noticed his reluctance. "You've done more than enough today, Aldridge. Go get some rest yourself." Garrett nodded, though something kept him rooted in place. "If it's all the same to you, I'd like to check on her condition tomorrow." Edmund studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Of course, the Davis family is in your debt." As Garrett finally turned to leave, Ruby emerged from the examination room. She caught up to him at the door, touching his arm lightly. "Mr. Aldridge, I don't know how to thank you." "No need for thanks, Miss Davis." She looked up at him, her dark eyes sincere in the lamplight. "Rosie asked me to tell you something. She said to remind you of your promise." Garrett's throat tightened. "I haven't forgotten." Ruby's lips curved in a small smile. "Neither has she. I think it's giving her strength." She hesitated, then added softly, "Will you come again tomorrow?" "Wild horses couldn't keep me away," he replied, surprising himself with the truth in those words. That night, as he made camp just outside of town, preferring the open air to the confines of the hotel, Garrett found himself unable to sleep. The image of Rosalind's brave face, as he'd lifted her from the wrecked stagecoach, kept returning to him. along with Ruby's quiet strength throughout the ordeal. They were unlike any women he'd encountered in his travels, and he couldn't help but wonder what twist of fate had brought them into his life. Morning came with the soft pink light of dawn filtering through the cottonwoods. Garrett broke camp early and rode into town, stopping first at the general store to purchase a few items before heading to the doctor's office. He'd spent most of his available cash, but the expense seemed insignificant compared to the need. When he arrived, he found Ruby already there, her hair neatly pinned and her face freshly washed, though dark circles beneath her eyes betrayed her restless night. She was arranging wildflowers in a small jar by Rosalind's bedside when Garrett entered the room. "Mr. Aldridge," she greeted him, her face brightening, "you came back." "As promised," he replied, setting down the parcels he carried. He looked past her to where Rosalind lay, her golden hair spread across the pillow, her face peaceful in sleep. "How is she this morning?" Ruby's smile faltered slightly. "The doctor says the swelling hasn't increased, which is good news. She's in pain, but he's given her laudanum to help." She glanced at the packages he'd brought. "What's all this?" Garrett suddenly felt foolish. "Just some things I thought might be useful." "Books, since she'll be confined to bed, some dried fruit, a writing set so she can write letters." He shrugged, embarrassed by his impulsive purchases. "Probably silly notions." "Not silly at all," Ruby assured him, touching his arm gratefully. "It's very thoughtful. Rosie loves to read. It will help pass the time." A soft voice from the bed interrupted them. "Is that Garrett?" They both turned to see Rosalind awake, her blue eyes clearer than the day before, though pain lined her face despite the medication. Garrett moved to her bedside, removing his hat. "Good morning, Miss Davis. You're looking better today." A smile touched her lips. "Liar, but thank you for the courtesy." Her gaze shifted to the packages. "Are those for me?" "Just some small comforts," he acknowledged, suddenly self-conscious under her direct gaze. "Will you show me?" She asked, and there was something in her voice, a determination to engage with life despite her circumstances, that moved him deeply. For the next hour, Garrett sat beside Rosalind's bed, unwrapping each item and describing it to her, while Ruby busied herself organizing the small room. He'd selected books he thought a lady might enjoy: poetry by Tennyson and Wordsworth, a novel by Jane Austen that the shopkeeper's wife had recommended. Rosalind's eyes lit up at each revelation. "How did you know I love Wordsworth?" she asked, her fingers tracing the embossed cover. Garrett smiled. "Lucky guess, my mother was fond of poetry." "Was," Rosalind caught the past tense. "She passed during the war, typhoid." "I'm sorry," she said softly. "We lost our mother young as well. It leaves a hole that never quite fills, doesn't it?" Garrett nodded, surprised by her perception. Most people offered platitudes about time healing all wounds, but Rosalind had cut straight to the truth of grief. Their conversation was interrupted when Dr. Wilson entered to examine Rosalind. Garrett stepped outside with Ruby to give them privacy, finding himself strangely comfortable in her company despite their short acquaintance. "Uncle Edmund is making arrangements to bring Rosie to the ranch as soon as Dr. Wilson allows it," Ruby told him as they stood in the morning sunshine. "He's converting the study into a bedroom for her since it's on the ground floor." "That's good thinking," Garrett agreed. "She'll need time to heal." Ruby hesitated, then asked, "Do you really believe she'll walk again?" The question caught him off guard. In the harsh light of day, the promise he'd made seemed even more reckless. He'd seen men with similar injuries during the war who never regained the use of their legs. But he'd also witnessed remarkable recoveries that defied medical explanation. "I believe in your sister's spirit," he answered honestly, "and I believe in giving her hope to fight with." Ruby studied his face as if searching for deception, then nodded slowly. "So do I, and I'll hold you to that promise, Mr. Aldridge." "I'd expect nothing less, Miss Davis." Over the next several days, Garrett found himself returning to Silver Creek each morning, ostensibly to check on Rosalind's progress, but increasingly drawn by the company of both Davis sisters. He'd never been a particularly social man. The solitude of his small ranch suited him. But there was something about Ruby's practical nature and Rosalind's quiet courage that called to him. On the fourth day, he arrived to find Ruby alone, sitting on the bench outside the doctor's office with a worried expression. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately, dismounting. "Dr. Wilson is changing Rosie's bandages. She was in such pain this morning." Her voice trailed off, and he could see she was fighting tears. Without thinking, Garrett sat beside her and took her hand. "Your sister is strong, Ruby, stronger than she looks." Ruby nodded, clinging to his hand like a lifeline. "I know, it's just we've always taken care of each other. After our parents died, it was just us against the world, and now I can't do anything to help her." "You're doing more than you know," Garrett assured her. "Your presence gives her strength." She looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his face. "Why do you keep coming back, Garrett?" "You've done your good deed. Most men would have moved on by now." It was a fair question, and one he'd asked himself each time he rode into town. The truth was complicated. Initially, it had been concern for Rosalind's condition and a sense of responsibility for the promise he'd made. But as the days passed, he'd found himself drawn to both sisters in different ways, admiring Ruby's practical strength and Rosalind's quiet dignity in the face of suffering. "I suppose I want to see things through," he finally answered. "And truth be told, I enjoy your company, both of you." Ruby smiled, some of the worry leaving her face. "We enjoy yours too. Rosie especially brightens when you visit. I haven't seen her smile like that since before Father died." Before Garrett could respond, Dr. Wilson emerged from his office, wiping his hands. "She's resting now," he informed them. "The swelling has decreased somewhat, which is encouraging. If this progress continues, she can be moved to the ranch in another few days." "Has she regained any feeling in her legs?" Garrett asked. The doctor's expression turned cautious. "There have been some minor sensations, pins and needles," she describes it, which could indicate nerve function returning. "But I don't want to raise false hopes. These injuries are unpredictable." Ruby squeezed Garrett's hand before releasing it. "Can I see her now?" Briefly, Dr. Wilson agreed. "She needs rest." As Ruby went inside, Garrett remained on the bench, considering the doctor's words. Minor sensations were a small sign that perhaps his rash promise hadn't been entirely foolhardy. "Mr. Aldridge," the doctor addressed him directly. "I understand you've been visiting regularly." Garrett nodded, uncertain where this was leading. "Miss Davis Rosalind seems to draw strength from your visits. Her spirits are notably higher afterward, which can only benefit her recovery." He hesitated, then added, "However, I feel I should caution you against giving her unrealistic expectations. Spinal injuries are complex, and while I pray she recovers fully, you should prepare yourself for the possibility that she may never walk unassisted again." Garrett met the older man's gaze steadily. "With all due respect, Doctor, sometimes hope is the best medicine we have." Dr. Wilson studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Perhaps you're right, just be careful with her heart as well as her hopes." The warning struck Garrett more deeply than he expected. Was he giving Rosalind false hope? And what of his own feelings, which seemed to grow more complicated with each visit? When he entered the examination room a short while later, he found Rosalind propped up on pillows, her face pale but her eyes alert. Ruby sat beside her, reading aloud from one of the poetry books he'd brought. "Garrett," Rosalind greeted him, her smile illuminating her face despite her obvious discomfort. "Ruby's been reading Wordsworth to me. I'd forgotten how beautiful his words are." He returned her smile, settling into the chair on the opposite side of the bed. "My mother always said poetry was food for the soul when the body was ailing." "Your mother sounds like a wise woman," Rosalind said. "She was." He glanced at the book in Ruby's hands. "I wandered lonely as a cloud," Ruby nodded. "Rosie requested it." Something about daffodils dancing seemed to appeal to her today. A shadow crossed Rosalind's face, quickly replaced by determination. "I will dance again one day," she said quietly. "I felt something in my toes this morning, just a tingling, but Dr. Wilson says it's a good sign." Garrett's heart swelled with hope. That is good news. For the next hour, they talked easily together, the conversation flowing naturally between the three of them. Ruby spoke of their childhood in Boston, of their father's shipping business and their mother's love of music. Garrett shared stories of his small ranch and the wild mustangs he occasionally captured and trained. It struck him how comfortable he felt with them, how the usual guardedness he maintained with others had somehow evaporated in their presence. As the afternoon waned, Ruby excused herself to meet with their uncle, who was overseeing the preparations at the ranch for Rosalind's arrival. Left alone with Rosalind, Garrett found himself suddenly aware of her as a woman rather than just a patient. The delicate curve of her neck, the determination in her blue eyes, the quiet strength that radiated from her despite her condition. "You're staring, Mr. Aldridge," she observed with a slight smile. He felt heat rise to his face. "My apologies, Miss Davis. No need to apologize. And please call me Rosalind. After all, you've seen me at my worst, unconscious and covered in dirt." Her attempt at levity was undermined by the flash of vulnerability in her eyes. "Hardly your worst," he replied. "Even half dead in a stagecoach wreck, you were the most dignified woman I've ever seen." Her cheeks colored at the compliment. "You're too kind, but I wasn't feeling very dignified." "I was terrified. Fear and dignity aren't mutually exclusive," Garrett pointed out. "Some of the bravest men I knew during the war were scared out of their wits." "You fought?" she asked, her expression softening with interest. 2 years with the Union cavalry." "Not something I care to remember most days." Rosalind nodded understandingly. "My father said war changes a man. Is that why you live alone, so far from town?" The question was personal, perhaps too personal from someone he'd known less than a week, but Garrett found himself answering truthfully. "Partly. After I came back, crowds made me uneasy. Too much noise, too many people. The solitude suited me." He paused, then added, "Or I thought it did." "And now," she prompted gently. He met her gaze, surprised by the genuine interest he saw there. "Now I'm not so sure." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Finally, Rosalind broke the silence. "Will you read to me? My eyes are tired, but I'd like to hear more Wordsworth." Garrett picked up the book Ruby had left behind, finding his place by the bookmark. He began to read, his deep voice giving weight to the poet's words about nature's healing power. As he read, he noticed Rosalind's eyelids growing heavy, the pain medication drawing her toward sleep. When he was certain she drifted off, he closed the book quietly and stood to leave. But as he turned away, her hand caught his wrist with surprising strength. "Thank you, Garrett," she murmured, her eyes still closed, "for keeping your promise to visit, and for believing I'll walk again when everyone else has doubts." He covered her hand with his own. "Rest now. I'll return tomorrow." Outside, the setting sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple, a sight that would normally have sent Garrett hurrying back to his cabin before darkness fell. Instead, he found himself lingering in town, his thoughts occupied by the Davis sisters and the strange turn his solitary life had taken. The following days established a pattern. Garrett would arrive in town by mid-morning, spend time with Rosalind while Ruby attended to arrangements for their new life at the Silver Spur, then join Ruby for a meal at the small cafe on Silver Creek's Main Street. Their conversations ranged widely from books to politics to the changing landscape of the West. Ruby proved to be not only practical but highly educated, with strong opinions on women's suffrage and the treatment of Native Americans that surprised Garrett with their progressiveness. "Father believed education should know no gender," she explained one afternoon as they shared coffee. "He sent us to the same schools as our male cousins, much to our aunt's dismay." "Your father sounds like he was ahead of his time," Garrett remarked. "In some ways," Ruby agreed. "In others, he was very traditional. He expected us both to make suitable marriages eventually, though he wanted us to choose partners with our heads as well as our hearts." Garrett nodded, wondering if either sister had left suitors behind in Boston. The thought bothered him more than it should have. "And what of you?" Ruby asked, her dark eyes curious. "Have you never thought of marriage, Garrett?" He shook his head. "Not seriously, after the war." He trailed off, uncertain how to explain the darkness that had followed him home from the battlefields, the nightmares, the inability to connect with others, the comfort he'd found in isolation. Ruby didn't press, but her expression was understanding. War leaves scars that don't show on the outside. Our father was never quite the same after he returned from Mexico in '48. Her perception startled him. Most people didn't recognize the invisible wounds carried by veterans or chose to ignore them. Your sister mentioned something similar, he said. You're both unusually perceptive. Ruby smiled. We've had our share of hardships. It teaches you to look beneath the surface. She hesitated, then added, Rosie has always been the more sensitive one, feeling things deeply, seeing into people's hearts. I'm the practical one, making plans and keeping us grounded. You complement each other, Garrett observed. We do, Ruby agreed, her expression softening with affection for her sister. Which is why seeing her like this. Her voice faltered. Garrett reached across the table, taking her hand as he had that day outside the doctor's office. She's improving every day, Ruby, doctor. Wilson says the tingles in her legs are increasing. Ruby nodded, gathering herself. I know, and Uncle Edmund has hired a nurse from Santa Fe who's had experience with similar injuries. She'll arrive next week. She squeezed his hand gratefully. I don't know what we would have done without you, Garrett. These past days would have been unbearable. There was something in her eyes, a warmth that went beyond gratitude that made Garrett acutely aware of her hand in his. Ruby was beautiful in her own right, not with Rosalind's golden delicacy, but with a dark, vibrant energy that drew people to her. In another life, under different circumstances, he might have, but the thought remained unfinished as doctor. Wilson entered the cafe, making his way directly to their table. Mr. Aldridge, Miss Davis, he greeted them, his expression unreadable. I've been looking for you. Ruby's hand tightened on Garrett's. Is it Rosie? Has something happened? Nothing alarming, the doctor assured her quickly. In fact, quite the opposite. Your sister asked me to find you both immediately. She has something to show you. They hurried back to the doctor's office where they found Rosalind sitting up in bed, her face flushed with excitement. Ruby, Garrett, she called as they entered. Watch this. With intense concentration, Rosalind fixed her gaze on her feet, which were visible beneath the blanket. Slowly, agonizingly, her right foot moved, just a slight flexing of the ankle, but unmistakably a voluntary movement. Ruby's hand flew to her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. Garrett felt his own throat tighten with emotion. I felt it this morning, Rosalind explained, her voice trembling with excitement. A strange burning sensation all the way down my leg, and then I could move it. Just a little, but I could. Dr. Wilson was more measured in his response. It's encouraging, certainly. The swelling must be subsiding, allowing some nerve function to return. But we mustn't get ahead of ourselves. There's still a long road to full recovery, if that's even possible. But his caution couldn't diminish the joy in the room. Ruby embraced her sister carefully, tears flowing freely now. Garrett stood back, watching the scene with a mixture of elation and something more complex, a sense that the promise he'd made might actually be fulfilled. And with it, his reason for remaining so closely involved in the Davis sisters' lives. Rosalind looked past her sister, finding Garrett's eyes. You promised, she said simply, and I believed you. The conviction in her voice humbled him. The credit belongs to your own strength, Rosalind. I just happened to be the messenger. Later that evening, as Garrett prepared to return to his ranch for the first time in days, needing to check on his livestock and gather more supplies, Edmund Davis intercepted him outside the livery stable. Aldridge, the older man called, approaching with purposeful strides. A moment of your time. Garrett paused in the act of saddling his horse. Mr. Davis, Edmund's expression was difficult to read in the gathering dusk. I understand you've been spending considerable time with my nieces. There was no accusation in his tone, but Garrett felt defensive nonetheless. I've been concerned for Miss Rosalind's recovery. Edmund nodded slowly. So I've gathered, and I'm grateful for your assistance both at the Stagecoach and since, but I feel I should understand your intentions. The question caught Garrett off guard. My intentions? Yes, Edmund replied evenly. 2 unmarried, well-bred young women, recently orphaned and new to the territory. You can understand my concern as their guardian. Garrett felt heat rise to his face. He hadn't examined his own motives too closely. let alone considered how his constant presence might appear to others. "Mr. Davis, I assure you my only intention has been to see Miss Rosalind recovered and Miss Ruby supported through this difficult time." Edmund studied him for a long moment. "You've developed no particular attachment to either of my nieces?" The question hung in the air between them. Garrett couldn't honestly deny feeling drawn to both sisters. Rosalind's quiet courage and Ruby's vibrant strength had affected him deeply. But attachment, that suggested something more lasting, more committed than the confused tangle of emotions he'd been experiencing. "I admire them both greatly," he finally answered. "Beyond that, I haven't presumed to think." Edmund's expression softened slightly. "I see. Well, I should inform you that both my nieces come with substantial dowries. Their father's shipping business was quite successful, and they will inherit equally upon reaching 21, which Ruby already has, and Rosalind will next month." Garrett frowned, offended by the implication. "Sir, if you're suggesting my interest is financial," Edmund held up a hand. "Not at all. I'm merely stating facts that any potential suitor should be aware of. The girls will have no shortage of callers once they're established here, regardless of Rosalind's current condition." He paused, then added more gently, "I've made inquiries about you, Aldridge. You fought honorably during the war, built your ranch from nothing, and have a reputation for fair dealing. I have no objection to your friendship with my nieces. I simply want to understand where things stand." Garrett wasn't sure himself where things stood. He only knew that the prospect of no shortage of callers for the Davis sisters filled him with an unexpected dismay. "I appreciate your candor, Mr. Davis," he said carefully, "and I assure you I have nothing but respect for your nieces. If my presence becomes unwelcome to them or to you, I'll withdraw." Edmund nodded, apparently satisfied. "Fair enough, and now I understand Rosalind has shown some improvement today." The conversation shifted to safer ground, but Edmund's questions lingered in Garrett's mind as he rode back to his ranch that night. The moon illuminated the familiar landscape, the rugged mountains, the pine forests, the small cabin and corral he'd built with his own hands after returning from the war. It had been his sanctuary, his place of healing. Now, for the first time, it felt oddly empty. His dog, Bear, greeted him enthusiastically, and his small herd of cattle seemed none the worse for his absence. The routine tasks of ranch life, feeding the animals, checking the fences, repairing a loose shingle on the roof, occupied the next day, but his thoughts repeatedly drifted to Silver Creek and the Davis sisters. Which one held his heart? The question nagged at him as he worked. Rosalind, with her quiet strength and the vulnerability that called to his protective instincts. Or Ruby, with her practical nature and the understanding that seemed to bridge the gap between his war-damaged soul and the world. The truth was he admired them both, was drawn to them both, but in different ways. And the realization left him more confused than ever. By the time he returned to Silver Creek 2 days later, his confusion had only deepened. He arrived at the doctor's office to find preparations underway to move Rosalind to the Silver Spur Ranch. Dr. Wilson had finally given his approval, satisfied that the initial danger had passed and that Rosalind could continue her recovery in more comfortable surroundings. Ruby greeted him with a warm smile that made his heart skip. "Garrett, we were hoping you'd return today. Rosie's going home well, to our new home anyway." "That's wonderful news," he replied, following her into the examination room where Rosalind was being prepared for transport. She was sitting up, dressed in a simple blue gown that matched her eyes, her golden hair braided down her back. Despite the pallor that still clung to her features, she looked more like herself than she had since the accident. "Our hero returns," she said with a teasing smile that didn't quite mask the genuine pleasure in her eyes. "Just in time to see me leave this place." Garrett removed his hat, suddenly conscious of his trail dusty appearance after 2 days at the ranch. "Hardly a hero, but glad to see you well enough to move. Dr. Wilson says I can try sitting in a chair tomorrow," Rosalind informed him excitedly, "and perhaps stand with support by next week if the improvement continues." Her optimism was infectious, and Garrett found himself sharing her hope despite Dr. Wilson's more cautious prognosis. "One step at a time," he reminded her, then winced at the unfortunate choice of words, but Rosalind laughed. "Exactly. Literal steps, I hope." The ease between them warmed him, as did the way Ruby moved about the room, anticipating her sister's needs without being asked. The bond between the sisters was evident in every interaction, a closeness born of shared loss and mutual dependence that Garrett, an only child, found both fascinating and enviable. Edmund Davis arrived soon after with a wagon specially outfitted with a mattress and blankets to transport Rosalind comfortably. Dr. Wilson supervised the transfer, giving final instructions to the nurse who would be taking over Rosalind's care at the ranch. "You're welcome to accompany us, Aldridge," Edmund offered as they prepared to depart. "I'm sure the girls would appreciate your company." The invitation surprised Garrett, given their conversation a few days earlier, but he accepted gratefully. He rode alongside the wagon as they made their way slowly out of town, watching how carefully Ruby attended to Rosalind's comfort during the journey, adjusting pillows and offering water at regular intervals. The Silver Spur Ranch was impressive, a sprawling main house built of local stone with a wide veranda, surrounded by well-maintained outbuildings and corrals filled with quality horses. It was clear that Edmund Davis had prospered in the decade since settling in the territory. As ranch hands helped carry Rosalind inside to the converted study that would serve as her bedroom, Garrett remained outside with Ruby, both of them needing a moment's respite from the tension of the journey. "It's beautiful here," he observed, taking in the panoramic view of mountains and valley visible from the ranch house. Ruby nodded, pushing a strand of dark hair from her face. "It is, though it's not home yet." She glanced at him, a hint of vulnerability in her expression. "Everything still feels temporary, like we're just visiting." "That will change with time," he assured her, understanding the sentiment all too well. He'd felt the same displacement after the war until he'd built his cabin with his own hands and worked the land until it yielded to his efforts. Ruby studied his face. "You understand, don't you, what it's like to be uprooted?" "I do," he admitted. "After the war, I couldn't go back to Illinois, too many ghosts, so I came west and started over." "And now, does this place feel like home?" The question gave him pause. For years, his small ranch had been his refuge, his place of healing, but lately, "Most days," he answered honestly, "though I find myself in town more often than usual these days." Ruby's smile held a hint of mischief. "I wonder why that is." Before Garrett could respond, Edmund called from the veranda that Rosalind was settled and asking for them both. The moment of intimacy broken, they made their way inside. The following weeks established a new routine. Garrett would ride to the Silver Spur every few days, ostensibly to check on Rosalind's progress, but increasingly drawn by the sense of belonging he felt in the company of both sisters. Rosalind's recovery continued steadily, first sitting in a chair, then standing with support, and finally taking a few faltering steps with the aid of Ruby on one side and the nurse, Miss Holloway, on the other. Each milestone was celebrated as the triumph it was, and Garrett found himself caught up in the sisters' optimism despite his own lingering doubts about the extent of recovery possible. Dr. Wilson, who visited weekly, maintained his cautious stance but acknowledged that Rosalind was progressing better than he had initially expected. "She may never regain full function," he told Garrett privately during one such visit, "but she's young and determined. I wouldn't be surprised if she manages to walk with a cane eventually." It wasn't the complete recovery Garrett had rashly promised, but it was far better than the permanent paralysis they had all feared in those first dark days after the accident. As summer progressed, Garrett found himself spending more time at the Silver Spur than at his own ranch, helping with tasks around the property and joining the family for meals. Edmund seemed to have accepted his presence, even seeking his advice on horse trading matters where Garrett's experience with Mustangs proved valuable. The evenings were Garrett's favorite time, when the day's work was done and the four of them would gather on the veranda. Edmund would smoke his pipe, Ruby would work on her embroidery or correspondence, and Garrett would read aloud from whatever book Rosalind had selected that day. Sometimes, if she was feeling strong enough, Rosalind would join them on the veranda in her wheelchair, her progress now including limited movement in both legs, though still far from walking independently. It was during one such evening in late August that Garrett realized how deeply entwined he had become in the Davis family's life. The realization came suddenly as he looked up from the book he was reading to find both sisters watching him with expressions of such warmth and affection that it took his breath away. "You've stopped reading, Mr. Aldridge," Rosalind pointed out with a teasing smile. "Has Mr. Dickens put you to sleep?" Garrett cleared his throat, embarrassed to be caught wool-gathering. "My apologies, I was just thinking." "About," Ruby prompted, setting aside her embroidery. He hesitated, then answered truthfully, "about how much has changed since that day at Apache Pass." Edmund removed his pipe from his mouth, regarding Garrett with a knowing expression. "Indeed, you've become quite a fixture here, Aldridge." There was no censure in his tone, but Garrett felt the weight of the observation nonetheless. He had become a fixture not just at the ranch, but in the sisters' lives, and they in his. The realization both comforted and alarmed him. Comforted because the emptiness that had plagued him since the war had receded in their company. Alarmed because his feelings for both women had only grown more complex with time. Rosalind had progressed from patient to friend to something more a kindred spirit, who understood his love of solitude and nature, who shared his appreciation for poetry and quiet contemplation. Their conversations during her physical therapy sessions, which he often assisted with, now ranged from philosophical to deeply personal, creating a bond that transcended her initial dependency. Ruby, meanwhile, had become his confidante, the person with whom he shared thoughts he'd never voiced to another soul about the war, about his dreams for his ranch, about his fears for the future. Her practical nature balanced his tendency toward introspection, and her quick wit never failed to lift his spirits on dark days. Two women as different as night and day, both essential to his newfound contentment. But this equilibrium couldn't last indefinitely, and Garrett knew it. Eventually, he would have to confront the truth of his feelings and the inevitable choice they would require. The opportunity came sooner than he expected. A week later, he arrived at the Silver Spur to find the ranch in a state of unusual activity. Hands were grooming horses in the corral, the cook was preparing what appeared to be a feast in the kitchen, and Edmund was directing the arrangement of additional chairs in the parlor. "What's the occasion?" Garrett asked, helping a ranch hand move a heavy sideboard. "Visitors from Santa Fe," Edmund explained. "Business associates from my Army days who are interested in investing in the ranch. They're bringing their families, including eligible sons." The last part was added with a significant look that Garrett didn't miss. So the callers Edmund had mentioned weeks ago were beginning to materialize. "I see," Garrett replied, trying to keep his tone neutral. "Will you need me to make myself scarce?" Edmund looked surprised. "Not at all. In fact, both girls specifically asked that you join us for dinner. Ruby's been teaching Rosalind a new song on the piano that they want to perform." His expression softened. "They value your opinion, Aldridge, as do I." The compliment did little to ease the knot forming in Garrett's stomach. The prospect of watching the Davis sisters entertain eligible sons from Santa Fe society was distinctly unpleasant. He found Ruby in the garden, cutting flowers for the dinner table. She looked up as he approached, her face brightening. "Garrett, you're early today." "Your uncle mentioned visitors, thought I might help with preparations." Ruby's expression clouded slightly. "Yes, the Harringtons and the Montgomerys, Uncle Edmund's old Army friends and their tedious families." She snipped a rose with more force than necessary. "I suspect matchmaking is on the agenda." The directness of her statement took him aback. "Your uncle mentioned eligible sons." Ruby rolled her eyes, an unladylike gesture that he found endearing. "3 of them, all as dull as dishwater if they're anything like their fathers. 2 for me, since I'm of age, and 1 for Rosie, though they'll likely change their minds when they see her condition." Garrett frowned at her bitter tone. Your sister's condition is temporary. Of course it is, Ruby agreed quickly, but you know how people are. They see the wheelchair, not the person. She hesitated, then added softly, not like you. There was something in her voice, a vulnerability beneath the practicality that made Garrett step closer, taking the basket of flowers from her hands. Ruby, there you are. Rosalind's voice interrupted them as she wheeled herself along the garden path, her progress with the chair now confident and smooth. She wore a new dress of pale blue that brought out the color of her eyes, and her golden hair was arranged in an elaborate style that must have taken the maid hours to create. Uncle Edmund said you'd arrived early, Garrett. I'm so glad. I need your help with something before our guests arrive. Ruby stepped back, reclaiming her basket. I should finish these arrangements. Excuse me. As she walked briskly toward the house, Garrett felt a sense of missed opportunity, though he couldn't have said exactly what he'd been about to confess. Rosalind watched her sister's departure with a thoughtful expression. Have I interrupted something? No, Garrett assured her quickly. Ruby was just telling me about your visitors. Rosalind made a face remarkably similar to her sister's earlier expression of disdain. Uncle Edmund's attempt at matchmaking, as if we haven't already made our own choices. The statement puzzled him. Your own choices, but Rosalind was already wheeling herself back toward the house. Never mind that now. I need your opinion on which piece to play tonight. Ruby's been teaching me a new song, but I'm nervous about performing for strangers. Will you listen and tell me honestly if it's ready to be heard? The afternoon passed quickly as Garrett helped Rosalind practice her piano piece, a poignant rendition of Beautiful Dreamer that showcased her delicate touch on the keys despite her weakened condition. Her determination to appear accomplished before the visitors touched him deeply. You play beautifully, he told her sincerely after her third run through. Your visitors will be enchanted. Rosalind smiled, but there was a shadow in her eyes. I wish I could dance for them as well. Before the accident, dancing was my greatest joy. Without thinking, Garrett knelt beside her wheelchair, taking her hands in his. You will dance again, Rosalind. I promised you that, and I intend to keep my word. She searched his face, her blue eyes intense. Even if it takes years, even if I need a cane or can only manage a slow waltz. Even then, he assured her, she squeezed his hands. Then I believe you, I always have. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken emotions. Garrett was acutely aware of her delicate hands in his, the trust in her eyes, the way her courage had consistently defied her circumstances. Rosalind, there you are, Ruby's voice from the doorway broke the spell. The guests have arrived early, and Uncle Edmund is looking for you both. Garrett rose quickly, feeling strangely guilty though he'd done nothing wrong. Ruby's expression was carefully neutral as she held the door for Rosalind's wheelchair, but he sensed a tension that hadn't been there earlier. The evening that followed was a study in social dynamics. The Harringtons and Montgomerys were precisely as Ruby had described them, wealthy, self-important families, whose patriarchs had served with Edmund in the Mexican-American War, and had since built fortunes in shipping and railroads. Their sons James and William Montgomery and Thomas Harrington were well-dressed, well-mannered young men whose conversation never strayed far from hunting, horses, and the superiority of Eastern education over frontier offerings. Garrett, introduced simply as a neighbor and friend of the family, found himself relegated to the periphery of conversations, observing rather than participating. He watched as Thomas Harrington, the youngest at 23, paid particular attention to Rosalind, seemingly undeterred by her wheelchair. James Montgomery, meanwhile, focused his attentions on Ruby, who maintained a polite but distant demeanor that Garrett recognized as her defense against unwanted advances. When dinner was announced, Garrett found himself seated between Mrs. Montgomery and Mrs. Harrington, far from either Davis' sister. The arrangement felt deliberate, and he caught Edmund's apologetic glance from the head of the table. The meal was elaborate by frontier standards: roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and vegetables from Edmund's garden, followed by an apple pie that the cook had been perfecting all day. The conversation flowed around Garrett, touching on Eastern politics, railroad expansion, and the latest fashions from Paris. He contributed little, keenly aware of his status as an outsider in this world of wealth and social connections. After dinner, the party moved to the parlor for entertainment. As promised, Ruby and Rosalind performed their duet, Ruby playing the melody while Rosalind added a delicate harmony that showcased her musical talent. Garrett watched from the back of the room. Struck by the tableau, they presented Ruby dark and vibrant, Rosalind fair and ethereal, both beautiful in their own distinct ways. When the applause died down, Thomas Harrington approached Rosalind's wheelchair, bending to speak to her with an intensity that sent an unexpected pang of jealousy through Garrett. James Montgomery, meanwhile, had claimed Ruby's hand for a promenade around the room, leaving Garrett standing alone, an observer rather than a participant in the evening's activities. It was in that moment, watching the Davis sisters engaged with their suitors, that clarity finally came to Garrett. The confusion that had plagued him for weeks, his feelings for both women, his uncertainty about his place in their lives, suddenly resolved into a single, undeniable truth. His heart had made its choice long ago. He had simply been too blind or too afraid to recognize it. The realization left him both liberated and terrified. Liberated because the path forward was now clear. Terrified because that path might lead to rejection and loss of the connection he'd come to cherish with both sisters. As the evening wore on, Garrett found himself increasingly restless, counting the minutes until he could politely take his leave. When Edmund finally escorted the guests to their waiting carriages, they were staying at the hotel in Silver Creek. Planning to return the following day for a tour of the ranch, Garrett prepared to depart as well. He found Ruby on the veranda, gazing up at the star-filled sky with an expression of contemplation that made her seem older than her 21 years. "Leaving so soon?" she asked without turning, having recognized his footsteps. "It's late," he replied, coming to stand beside her at the railing. "And I've imposed on your family's hospitality long enough." Now she did turn, her dark eyes searching his face. "You're never an imposition, Garrett. Surely you know that by now," he managed to smile. "Even when grand visitors from Santa Fe are present," Ruby made a dismissive gesture. "Especially then, your presence kept me sane through all that tedious conversation about railroad stocks and Paris fashions." She hesitated, then added more softly, "I miss talking with you tonight." The admission warmed him. "I miss talking with you too." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the night air cool and fragrant with the scent of pine from the surrounding forests. "James Montgomery has asked to call on me tomorrow," Ruby said suddenly. Formally, Garrett felt his chest tighten. "I see, and will you receive him?" She looked away, her profile outlined in silver by the moonlight. "Uncle Edmund thinks it would be a good match. The Montgomerys are well connected, and James will inherit his father's shipping business." "That doesn't answer my question," Ruby sighed, a sound of frustration rather than weariness. "What choice do I have? I'm 21, orphaned, dependent on my uncle's generosity. James Montgomery represents security, respectability, but not happiness," Garrett pressed, his heart racing now. She met his gaze directly. "Would you have me refuse him? On what grounds?" The question hung between them, fraught with unspoken implications. Garrett knew what she was asking, what she needed from him, but the words caught in his throat, tangled in doubts and fears, and the knowledge that his feelings, once declared, could never be retracted. Before he could find his voice, the door opened behind them and Rosalind appeared, being wheeled by her nurse. "I thought I heard voices out here," she said, smiling at them both. "What are you two conspiring about in the moonlight?" The moment shattered, Garrett stepped back from the railing. "Nothing of importance. I was just taking my leave." Rosalind's face fell. "So soon? I was hoping you might stay a while longer. Thomas Harrington has been bending my ear all evening about his father's railroad interests, and I'm in desperate need of intelligent conversation." The appeal in her eyes was genuine, and Garrett found himself unable to refuse. "Perhaps just a little longer then." As Miss Holloway discreetly withdrew, leaving the three of them alone on the veranda, Garrett felt the familiar ease of their companionship return. They talked of inconsequential things, the weather, the progress of Edmund's cattle, the book Garrett had brought on his last visit, but beneath the casual conversation ran currents of unspoken emotion that left him increasingly certain of the choice his heart had made. When he finally took his leave an hour later, both sisters watched him ride away, their silhouettes framed in the golden light from the house. The image stayed with him as he made his way back to his cabin, a visual representation of the crossroads he had reached. That night, as he lay awake watching moonlight filter through the cabin window, Garrett came to a decision. He would return to the Silver Spur the following day and speak his heart plainly, consequences be damned. The possibility of rejection paled beside the certainty of regret if he remained silent, while another man claimed the woman he loved. Dawn found him already on the trail, his resolve strengthening with each mile. But as he approached the Silver Spur, he was surprised to see a group of riders in the distance, heading away from the ranch toward the mountains. Through his field glass, he recognized Edmund Davis and the Montgomery brothers, along with several ranch hands, a hunting expedition, perhaps, or the promised tour of the property. At the ranch house, he found Ruby alone on the veranda, reading a letter with a troubled expression. She looked up as he approached, surprise giving way to pleasure on her face. "Garrett, I didn't expect you today." He dismounted, securing his horse to the hitching post. "I needed to speak with you. Is this a bad time?" She folded the letter carefully, tucking it into her pocket. "Not at all. Uncle Edmund has taken the Montgomerys and Harringtons to see the North Pasture. They'll be gone most of the day." "And Rosalind?" he asked, mounting the steps to the veranda, resting. The excitement yesterday tired her, though she'd never admit it. Ruby gestured to the chair beside hers. "Will you sit? You look serious this morning." Garrett remained standing, too restless to sit. "I am serious, what I have to say." He paused, gathering his courage. "Ruby, last night you asked what grounds you would have to refuse James Montgomery. I couldn't answer then, but I can now." Her eyes widened slightly, a flush rising to her cheeks. "Garrett, please let me finish before my courage fails," he interrupted gently. "Since the day I pulled you and your sister from that wrecked stagecoach, my life has changed in ways I never expected. The solitude I once cherished now seems empty without your presence, without your wit, your strength, your understanding." Ruby stood slowly, her dark eyes never leaving his face. "What are you saying, Garrett?" He took her hands in his, the final barrier to honesty falling away. "I'm saying that I love you, Ruby Davis. That if you'll have me, I want to court you properly, not because of your dowry or your connections, but because you've awakened something in me I thought died during the war. A capacity for joy, for connection, for love." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't pull away. "Oh, Garrett, I've waited so long to hear those words." Hope surged through him. "Then you feel the same?" "Of course I do," she whispered. "From that first day, when you carried Rosie from the wreckage with such gentleness, then stood beside me while the doctor examined her. Your strength became my strength when I needed it most." He released her hands only to cup her face gently. "I was so confused at first, drawn to both you and your sister in different ways. Rosalind's courage, her spirit. But it was always you, Ruby. Your practical heart, your fierce intelligence, the way you see me truly see me, past the silences and the scars the war left." Ruby leaned into his touch, a tear spilling down her cheek. "I thought perhaps you preferred Rosie. Most men do. She's the beauty of the family, the gentle one." "She is beautiful and gentle," Garrett agreed, "and I care for her deeply, but it's you who makes my heart race when you enter a room. You who understands the darkness I carry without being afraid of it, you who makes me believe in a future brighter than my past." Her smile was radiant through her tears. "Such pretty words from a man of so few." "I've been saving them," he replied, returning her smile. "For someone worth saying them to." When he finally kissed her, it felt like coming home after a long journey, a sense of rightness, of completion that he had never known before. Her arms wound around his neck, drawing him closer, and all the doubts and fears of the past weeks dissolved in the certainty of their shared feeling. When they parted, Breathless and smiling, Ruby rested her forehead against his. "James Montgomery will be disappointed," Garrett laughed softly. "I can't find it in my heart to feel sorry for him." A sound from the doorway made them both turn. Rosalind sat in her wheelchair, a shawl around her shoulders, watching them with an expression Garrett couldn't immediately read. "Rosie," Ruby began, stepping away from Garrett with a guilty flush. "We were just declaring your love for each other," Rosalind finished for her, wheeling herself forward. "It's about time." Garrett stared at her in confusion. "You're not." Surprised, a smile touched Rosalind's lips, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Of course not. I've watched you both these past months, the way you look at each other when you think no one is watching, the way you finish each other's thoughts, the way you argue and laugh together." She reached out, taking Ruby's hand. "I've never seen my sister so alive as when she's with you, Garrett." Relief washed through him, followed quickly by concern at the shadow of sadness he detected beneath Rosalind's composure. "Rosalind, don't," she interrupted gently. "Don't apologize for loving her. She deserves happiness more than anyone I know." She turned to Ruby, her smile warming. "We both lost so much when Father died. It eases my heart to see you find something precious in return." Ruby knelt beside her sister's wheelchair, tears flowing freely now. "Oh, Rosie, I never wanted to hurt you." "You haven't," Rosalind assured her, stroking her hair. "How could love ever hurt me?" She looked up at Garrett, her blue eyes clear and direct. "Just promise me one thing." "Anything," he replied without hesitation. "Keep your promise to me as well. Help me walk again, even if it's just a few steps, even if I need a cane for the rest of my life." "I want to dance at your wedding." The simple request, delivered with such quiet dignity, moved Garrett deeply. "I swear it," he told her, "on my honor." And in that moment, a bond was formed between the three of them that transcended romantic love, a commitment to each other's happiness that would sustain them through the challenges ahead. The following weeks brought significant changes to all their lives. James Montgomery, upon learning of Ruby's attachment to Garrett, withdrew with surprising grace, wishing them well before returning to Santa Fe with his family. Thomas Harrington, however, continued to call at the Silver Spur, his interest in Rosalind apparently undiminished by her condition, a development that pleased Edmund Davis greatly and left Garrett feeling cautiously optimistic for Rosalind's future. Ruby and Garrett's courtship progressed with the blessing of Edmund, who admitted to having suspected their feelings for some time. "Why do you think I invited you to stay that night when the Montgomerys arrived?" he asked Garrett with a knowing smile. "I wanted to see how you both reacted to potential rivals. The results were most illuminating." Garrett divided his time between his own ranch, now being expanded with help from Edmund, and some of the Silver Spur hands and the Davis home, where he continued to assist with Rosalind's physical therapy. Her progress remained steady, if slow. By late September, she could stand unassisted for short periods and walk a few steps with the aid of parallel bars that Edmund had constructed in the study. "Dr. Wilson says I'm exceeding his expectations," she told Garrett proudly one afternoon as they worked together on her exercises. "He believes I might graduate to a cane by Christmas." Garrett supported her as she took careful steps between the bars, her determination evident in every movement. "You'll be dancing by spring," he predicted. "Just in time for a certain wedding if your sister and your uncle approve my suit." Rosalind smiled up at him, no trace of sadness in her eyes now. "Ruby would marry you tomorrow if propriety allowed it. And Uncle Edmund thinks you walk on water since you helped him negotiate that horse deal with the army." Indeed, Edmund had begun to treat Garrett as the son he'd never had, including him in business discussions and seeking his advice on ranch matters. It was a role Garrett had never expected to fill, but one he found increasingly comfortable as his confidence in his place within the Davis family grew. October brought the first snow to the mountains, and a letter from Boston that changed Rosalind's life as dramatically as the Stagecoach accident had. Thomas Harrington, returning to Santa Fe after his third visit to the Silver Spur, had written to his father about the remarkable young woman he'd met, her courage, her musical talent, her determination to walk again. The elder Harrington, it seemed, had connections at a medical institute in Philadelphia that specialized in spinal injuries. "They want me to come east for treatment," Rosalind announced one evening as they gathered in the parlor. "Dr. Eberhardt has developed new techniques for cases like mine. The letter says he believes he could significantly improve my condition with his methods." Ruby, seated beside Garrett on the sofa, squeezed his hand. "That's wonderful news, Rosie, but Philadelphia is so far." "Thomas has offered to accompany me," Rosalind added, a slight blush coloring her cheeks, "along with Miss Holloway, of course, for propriety. His family has a home there where I could stay during treatment." Edmund, puffing thoughtfully on his pipe, nodded approval. "A generous offer." "Young Harrington seems quite devoted to your welfare." Rosalind's blush deepened. "He's been very kind and attentive." The implications weren't lost on any of them. Thomas Harrington's interest had clearly progressed beyond friendship, and Rosalind's feelings appeared to be developing in kind. "When would you leave?" Garrett asked, already calculating the impact on their wedding plans. He and Ruby had hoped for a spring ceremony, but if Rosalind would be in Philadelphia. "After Christmas," Rosalind replied. "The winter journey will be difficult, but Dr. Eberhardt believes starting treatment sooner rather than later will yield better results." Ruby's eyes filled with tears. 3 months is such a short time, and then to be separated for who knows how long. Rosalind wheeled herself across the room to take her sister's hands. "It won't be forever, just until I can walk well enough to travel home, and perhaps—" She hesitated, glancing at Edmund. "Perhaps you and Garrett could move your wedding forward. Before I leave, I may not be able to dance yet, but I could at least be present." Ruby looked at Garrett, a question in her eyes that he had no trouble interpreting. "I would marry you tomorrow if you wished it," he told her softly. "The timing matters less to me than the fact of becoming your husband." Edmund cleared his throat, clearly moved by the exchange. "A Christmas wedding, perhaps. There would be time to make the necessary arrangements, and the weather should still permit travel for those we might wish to invite." And so it was decided. Ruby and Garrett would be married 2 days before Christmas in the small church in Silver Creek, with Rosalind standing beside her sister standing. She insisted, even if she needed support to do so. The weeks that followed passed in a flurry of preparations. Ruby, with Rosalind and Miss Holloway's help, sewed her wedding dress, a creation of ivory satin with lace that Edmund had ordered specially from Santa Fe. Garrett, with the assistance of Edmund and the ranch hands, completed construction on an addition to his cabin that would serve as his and Ruby's home until a larger house could be built in the spring. Thomas Harrington became a frequent visitor, his affection for Rosalind growing more evident with each visit. He brought books on Philadelphia, maps of the journey they would take, and letters from Dr. Eberhardt outlining the treatment plan. His attentiveness touched Garrett, who recognized in the younger man the same protective instinct that had driven his own promise to Rosalind months earlier. "He loves her," Ruby observed one evening as they watched Thomas help Rosalind practice walking with her new cane in the parlor. "Not despite her injury, but including it as part of who she is." Garrett nodded, his arm around Ruby's waist. "She deserves nothing less." As December arrived, bringing with it the full onset of winter, Rosalind's progress accelerated remarkably. Whether motivated by the approaching wedding, the prospect of advanced treatment in Philadelphia, or Thomas's steady encouragement, she pushed herself harder in her therapy sessions, graduating from the parallel bars to a cane and finally achieving her goal of walking short distances unassisted. "Just in time," she told Garrett with triumph after crossing the parlor without support for the first time. "I'll be able to stand beside Ruby at the altar without leaning on anyone." The pride in her voice moved him deeply. "You've exceeded every expectation, Rosalind." "I've never known anyone with your determination." She smiled up at him, her blue eyes clear and peaceful. "I had excellent motivation, a promise from a man who always keeps his word." The day before the wedding, as snow fell gently outside, Garrett found Rosalind alone in the parlor, practicing a simple waltz step with her cane while softly humming to herself. She didn't notice him at first, and he watched from the doorway, marveling at how far she had come since that terrible day at Apache Pass. When she finally saw him, she stopped, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. Spying Mr. Aldridge, he stepped into the room, smiling. Admiring Miss Davis. "Your progress is remarkable. Not enough for a proper dance yet," she admitted, leaning on her cane. "But perhaps by the time I return from Philadelphia." "I have no doubt," Garrett assured her. He hesitated, then added, "I wanted a moment alone with you before tomorrow's festivities." "To thank you?" Rosalind tilted her head questioningly. "Thank me for what?" "For your grace," he replied simply. "From the beginning, you've shown such courage not just in your recovery but in how you've handled everything." He didn't need to elaborate. They both knew he was referring to the complicated emotional journey they'd all undertaken. She studied him for a moment, then set aside her cane and carefully made her way to a nearby chair, gesturing for him to join her. "May I tell you something, Garrett?" "Something I've never told anyone, not even Ruby." Intrigued, he sat across from her. "Of course." Rosalind smoothed her skirts, gathering her thoughts. "When you pulled me from that stagecoach and promised I would walk again, I believed you completely. Not because I knew you I didn't, but because in that moment of fear and pain, I saw something in your eyes. A certainty, a strength that I desperately needed." She paused, looking down at her hands. "In the days that followed, as I lay in the doctor's office, I thought I was falling in love with you. You were my hero, my savior. How could I not?" Garrett shifted uncomfortably, but she raised a hand to stop his response. "Let me finish. As I recovered and came to know you better, I realized what I felt wasn't romantic love at all. It was deeper than that, a connection of spirits, of understanding. You see, Garrett, we're alike, you and I. We both know what it is to be broken and to fight our way back to wholeness." Her insight startled him. It was true his wounds from the war had been invisible, but no less debilitating than her physical injuries. They had both faced the challenge of rebuilding a life that had been shattered by forces beyond their control. "But Ruby," Rosalind continued, "Ruby has always been the strong one, the one who faces life head-on, who plans and acts while others hesitate. She needs someone who understands the cost of that strength, who sees the vulnerability she hides from the world, someone like you." Garrett found himself deeply moved by her perception. "You're wiser than your years, Rosalind Davis," she smiled, a hint of mischief lightening her expression. "Wisdom born of necessity. When you can't run or dance or even walk, you learn to observe. To understand what isn't said as well as what is." She reached for his hand. "I want you to know that my heart is at peace. What I feel for Thomas is new and different, but no less real for being unexpected, and my joy in your marriage to Ruby is genuine." Garrett squeezed her hand gently. "I believe you, and I'm grateful beyond words for your friendship, for the bond we share." "As am I," she replied softly. "Now, help me up. I need to practice my walking if I'm to stand steadily tomorrow." The wedding day dawned clear and cold, the landscape transformed into a winter wonderland by the previous day's snow. The small church in Silver Creek was decorated with evergreens and red berries, and nearly the entire town turned out for the ceremony, along with visitors from neighboring ranches and as far away as Santa Fe. Ruby, radiant in her ivory gown, walked down the aisle on her uncle's arm. But it was the sight that preceded her that brought tears to Garrett's eyes. Rosalind, in a dress of pale blue, walking slowly but steadily on Thomas Harrington's arm, her cane nowhere in sight. She took her place at the front of the church, standing proudly beside the spot where her sister would soon join her. As Garrett and Ruby exchanged their vows, Garrett was acutely aware of the journey that had brought them to this moment, a journey that had begun with tragedy, but had led to a happiness more profound than either of them had dared to imagine. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Garrett bent to kiss his bride, the cheers that filled the small church seemed to celebrate not just their union but the triumph of hope over despair, of love over loss. The celebration that followed at the Silver Spur was joyous and unreserved. Edmund had spared no expense, and the house overflowed with guests, music, and laughter. As evening fell, Garrett found a moment alone with his new wife in the relative quiet of the study. "Happy, Mrs. Aldridge?" he asked, drawing her into his arms. Ruby's smile was answer enough, but she replied anyway. "Happier than I ever thought possible, and you, husband, complete," he told her simply. "For the first time in my life." Their moment of privacy was interrupted by the sound of Rosalind's voice calling for them. They found her in the parlor, standing beside Thomas with an expression of such excitement that Ruby immediately asked, "What is it, Rosie? What's happened?" "Thomas has asked me to marry him," Rosalind announced, her face glowing with happiness. "And I've accepted." The news was met with joyous congratulations, though Edmund looked momentarily concerned. "But Philadelphia," he began. "Will be our honeymoon," Thomas explained, his arm supportive around Rosalind's waist. "We'll be married here before we leave, with your blessing, sir. A small ceremony, just family." Edmund's concern gave way to pleasure. "Of course you have my blessing. This is a day for new beginnings, it seems." As the celebrations continued around them, Garrett found himself watching Rosalind and Thomas with a sense of deep satisfaction. The circle was complete, all of them moving forward into a future brighter than any they could have imagined that fateful day at Apache Pass. Later, as the musicians struck up a waltz, Garrett led Ruby onto the dance floor, holding her close as they moved to the music. From the corner of his eye, he saw Thomas leading Rosalind in a much slower version of the same dance, supporting her carefully, but allowing her the joy of movement she had feared lost forever. "Look at them," Ruby murmured, following his gaze. "She's dancing, Garrett. You kept your promise." He tightened his arms around his wife, his heart full. "We all did. We promised each other hope when it seemed in short supply, and here we are whole together and moving forward." Ruby rested her head against his shoulder. "It's just the beginning, isn't it?" "Just the beginning," he agreed, thinking of the home they would build together, the children they hoped for, the life stretching out before them. A life that had seemed impossible during those dark days after the war, when he'd retreated to his solitary cabin with his wounds and his memories. A life made possible by a chance encounter on a dusty road, a rash promise made in the heat of the moment, and the courage of two remarkable women who had taught him that even the deepest wounds could heal with time, determination, and love. Epilogue: 5 years later, the sound of children's laughter filled the air as Garrett rode up to the sprawling ranch house that had replaced his modest cabin 3 years earlier. Two young boys, aged 4 and 2, raced across the porch to meet him, their faces alight with excitement. "Papa's home," shouted the older one, George, named for Garrett's father. Garrett dismounted, scooping both boys into his arms with practiced ease. "Have you two been good for your mother today?" "As good as can be expected," Ruby replied, appearing in the doorway with a smile that still made his heart skip. The years had only enhanced her beauty, motherhood adding a softness to her practical nature that complemented her strength. He kissed her in greeting, ignoring the exaggerated disgust of their sons. "Any word from Santa Fe?" Ruby's smile widened. "Better than word. Come see for yourself." Following her into the house, Garrett found the parlor occupied by visitors Rosalind and Thomas Harrington, returned from their latest trip to Philadelphia, and their 3-year-old daughter, Eleanor. But what caught his attention was the sight of Rosalind walking toward him without a cane, her gait steady if slightly careful. "Garrett," she exclaimed, embracing him warmly. "What do you think? Dr. Eberhardt's final treatment was a success. I'm officially declared as recovered as medically possible." Garrett hugged her tightly, remembering the frightened young woman in the wrecked stagecoach who couldn't feel her legs. "I think you're the most determined person I've ever known, Rosalind Harrington." Thomas joined them, pride evident in his expression. "The doctors in Philadelphia call her their miracle patient. They've documented her case for medical journals." "Not a miracle," Rosalind corrected gently, "just persistence and excellent care. And a promise that gave me hope when I needed it most." As the family gathered for dinner, the conversation flowed easily between them, updates on the railroad Thomas was helping to build, news of Edmund's recent marriage to a widow from Denver, plans for expanding the combined Aldridge-Davis Ranch holdings now that Ruby's business acumen had helped make it one of the most prosperous in the territory. After the meal, as the children played under the watchful eye of the nursemaid, the adults moved to the veranda to enjoy the mild spring evening. Garrett found himself standing beside Rosalind, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. "Do you ever think about that day?" she asked quietly. "The stagecoach, the promise?" "Often," he admitted. "It changed all our lives in ways we couldn't have imagined." She nodded, her gaze on the horizon. "I was so afraid then, not just of being paralyzed, but of being a burden to Ruby, of never finding someone to love me as I was." And now, a smile of profound contentment touched her lips. "Now I know that love sees beyond physical limitations, that family is more than blood, that promises made from the heart can work miracles of their own." Garrett nodded, understanding completely. "A wise woman once told me that we're alike, you and I, both broken in different ways, both fighting our way back to wholeness." "And have you found it?" she asked. "Wholeness?" He looked across the veranda to where Ruby sat with Thomas, laughing at something he'd said, her face animated in the fading light. Their sons played at her feet, and in the distance, the ranch spread out before them, a legacy they were building together for future generations. "I have," he answered simply, "more than I ever dreamed possible." Rosalind followed his gaze, then smiled up at him. "As have I, and it all began with a promise made by a stranger who became family." "You'll walk again," he quoted softly. "I swear it." "The best promise ever kept," she replied, linking her arm through his as they rejoined the others to watch the stars emerge in the vast New Mexico sky. Their once broken lives now healed, whole, and filled with the blessing of love that had found them all in the aftermath of tragedy.